This is the first fun video about different religions that I'm doing, and I've decided to put these videos together partly for charade training purposes and partly just for information purposes. Anyone who wants to look at them and get a basic idea about what these different religions are about. I'll be looking at all of the major world religions as well as several influential religions that maybe you haven't heard of, but have been important nonetheless. And my purpose in doing this is to provide information. This happens to be an area in which I have expertise, and there's a lot of misinformation out there about different religions, and it really seems to me that, religion isn't going to go away anytime soon, no matter what anybody thinks about it. So it's more important to have good information out there. So let's start with the big ones. Now, I'm beginning with Zoroastrianism because Zoroastrianism is my favorite of the large world religions, even though it may not be one that some of you have heard of. It's also been historically one of the most influential. And considering the high degree of minority status that Zoroastrians currently have in the world, there's only about 150,000 of them left. I consider it to be really important to at least let you know about this fascinating and highly significant religious tradition. And we'll begin just by showing a picture here of what is called the Frahavahar. And that's the name of the symbol. And this symbol has come down through history to actually represent Zoroastrianism, which is kind of interesting because no one can really agree what it's a depiction of. Not even Zoroastrians really know exactly what it's a depiction of, whether it's a depiction of a king, or it's probably not of Ahura Mazda, the great god, because there weren't images of him generally. And or whether it's a picture supposed to be of Zarathustra himself, the prophet, we really don't know. So there's a lot of debate about it, but we know that that for a long time, even before the Sasanian Empire, which was the last great Zoroastrian empire, even before then, this was a symbol of that religion. Now, Zoroastrianism is it's a very westernized word that's used to describe the tradition, based on Zoroaster, which is the Greek pronunciation of Zarathustra, who was the actual prophet whose revelation resulted essentially in the development of this religion. Zarathustra referred to his own revelation as Dina Vanghuhi, or the inspiration to goodness, or being inspired to do goodness. And that's how he referred to his tradition. Zoroastrians over the years have referred to their tradition in a number of different ways. But generally now people refer to it as Zoroastrianism. That's sort of become the Western way of describing the religion. And you see here the ongoing and continuous ethical code that Zoroastrians practice and engage in even to the present day, the good thoughts, the good words, the good deeds, or humakta hukta varta, as it's often pronounced. Now, as you can imagine, we have to get into a little bit of history in order to understand where Zoroastrians came from. And some of this history is linked, of course, to the history of Persia/Iran. And I'm not going to go through this history exhaustively. You can stop the video and kind of look at this and get a sense of it. I'm not going to just read it, but I am going to point out some things in it. For example, it's not clear exactly when Zoroastrianism began. We don't know exactly when Zarathustra lived. And the dates that are given for him are usually somewhere between 1600 BCE and 600 BCE. And the reason for that is that there's a lot of discrepancy in the different sources that are used to date him. For example, if you if you look at Greek sources, they date him much more closely to the 600 BCE date. But if you actually look at the texts themselves that are attributed to him, songs that are part of the original revelation that survived, what you notice is that the language in which he spoke, and then that were later written down, is exactly cognate to portions of the Rig Veda, the language which is in Sanskrit. And we know the approximate date of those texts. So it seems as if probably Zarathustra lived further back than 600 BCE. But again, we don't know for sure. And I'll show you a map and try to point out where it's thought he basically came from. What we do know is that by the 6th century BCE, by about 549, all of Persia was basically unified under Zoroastrian principles during what is called the Achaemenian period, or the Great Persian Empire. And that is the time period that gave us great kings of the past, Cyrus the Great, Darius the Great, who are mentioned in the Bible, actually. And it represented, the Persian Empire at that time represented the largest pre-Roman empire of the ancient world. And there were a number of things that came out of it. The Persian Empire, Cyrus the Great, for example, figures importantly in several places in Jewish texts in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, the prophet Ezra refers to Cyrus as Moshiach, or Messiah, which is the first time that that word is actually used in Jewish literature. So that should give you some indication of how important, at least for the Jews and their memory of things, how important Persia was, and Cyrus the Great was. Now, this empire lasted until 331 BCE, when it was conquered by Alexander the Great. And that changed, of course, the course of Persian history and the course of Zoroastrianism generally. After Alexander died, his empire fragmented because he left no successor. And what that did is it created what's called in history an interregnum period, in which you have various political forces, families generally, or in the case of Iran or Persia, you have various ethnic groups. Iran is actually comprised of a number of different significant ethnic groups, and they would fight for supremacy. For a little while, a group of Greek rulers or governors, if you will, that Alexander had provisionally set up before he died, they ruled, but eventually they were overthrown by a family called the Arsacids. And it was under the Arsacids that the Zoroastrian priests began to reassert themselves regionally. And they also began the process of assembling their own texts at that time. Because one of the things that had happened in among Zoroastrians was that most of the texts, particularly the revered texts of Zarathustra, had been preserved orally. But when the Greeks conquered, they began a process of slaughtering the priests. And after the Arsacids took over, after the Zoroastrians regained control, they learned from that, and they realized they needed to write things down. And so they started to do that. And one of the things they started to assemble was what was called the Purity Code, which were certain rules, taboos, ways in which Zoroastrianism could set itself apart. And then finally, in the year 224 CE, this is after the Advent, after the first century, so after when Jesus was supposed to be born, it's the Common Era, you have another group called the Sassanians, or sometimes it's called the Sassanid Empire. And they were a different family that overthrew the Arsacids. The Arsacids had developed into the Parthian Empire as a different family took them over. And so the Sassanians, the whole process whereby they became kings, it's something right out of Game of Thrones. I mean, seriously, Essentially, you have an ethnic minority king. He overthrows an establishment ruler with the help of a fanatic religious priest whose name is Carter. And in fact, Carter is the only Zoroastrian priest of which I'm aware that there were actually inscriptions made of him, like depictions made of him. Under the Sassanians, Zoroastrianism became the sole state religion. They outlawed all other minority religions. Previous to this, Zoroastrianism had been famous for its tolerance of minority religions. But under the Sassanians, that process ended, and they became wealthy and powerful. They engaged in continuous warfare with the Roman Empire, and that state lasted until the 7th century, when, after they had exhausted themselves in their various wars with the Romans, they were overrun by the Arab Muslims. So here is a basic map of the Persian Empire, and this is about 500 BCE. This is under Cyrus and then later Darius. And keep in mind that this is the Persian Empire. If you know the history of the Persians and the Greeks, like if you've seen the movie 300, for example, this is what the Greeks are terrified of. They're terrified of being conquered by the Persians. If you follow my mouse or my cursor here, you'll notice where it's pointing here, right to the south of the Caspian Sea. It's right in this area here that it is thought that Zarathustra came from, somewhere in here. We don't know exactly where. But you can see that the eastern end of the empire runs right up against what is now presently the western part of China. It goes all the way up to the Indus River, which is now in Pakistan, which was an old traditional border into India proper. And it runs through the Middle East, through much of the Mediterranean, the southern part of the Black Sea, down across the northern part of the Arabian Peninsula, into all of Egypt and a fairly large portion of northern Africa. So this was a huge empire. It was an empire like no other empire at the time. Not even China, at its greatest extent during the Han Dynasty or the Tang Dynasty, had the level of diverse religions and ethnicities and languages that the Persian Empire did. And it was something that the Roman Empire, when they expanded, sought to emulate. They sought to emulate the Persian Empire, essentially. And this is one of the pictures, effigies, and inscriptions of Carter. There are different ways you can pronounce it, that crazy Zoroastrian priest. And he sponsored the execution and destruction of a number of different leaders of minority religions. Probably the most famous one was the prophet Mani, who was the single most important prophet for the religion of Manichaeism. Manichaeism no longer exists, but in the ancient world it was one of the most important and extensive religions. It influenced the development of the Catholic Church. It influenced the development of certain Buddhist ideas, and this is in the years 300 to 500 CE or AD. And this other map shows how far it spread. It was actually one of the most widespread of the ancient religions. And I'm going to actually do a different video about it, because this is one of those religions where, because it no longer exists, people don't know how important it was. But it was actually a highly significant religion in the ancient world, the classical world. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end this first video now, and we'll continue on in the second video.